Good afternoon. For those of you I haven't met yet, I'm Vali Nasser, the Dean here at SAIS. It's my great pleasure to welcome everyone to this reunion weekend. It's wonderful to see the community come back to the school from different years they've been here. It's even better to see them reconnect and see them disenergized and engaged. And I think it's a new tradition for us to have these on a more regular basis and bring everyone back to SAIS on an ongoing basis. And we hope even past this reunion weekend we'll continue to see you at various functions and events at the school. So I thought I'll take a few minutes in addition to welcoming you to say a bit about SAIS. I mean, some of you have been here on and off or live in DC and see us often. But when you visit SAIS's buildings, not much looks like it has changed. But to tell you about what's been happening at the school and where the school is going and how do we see the evolution of the school going forward. So there has been at the core of it, our mission of educating the next generation of world leaders, providing thought leadership, has remained very much the same, but SAIS has changed in many ways to deepen its academic capabilities in order to be able to address changes in the world and to remain the premier institution that it has been. There have been new programs that the school has introduced. We have, since 5 years ago, a new one-year, 11-month degree in international economic and finance. It starts in June. It starts in July, finishes in June. It's about a cohort of about 45 students. They're all interested in economics, pure and simple. It's sort of 3 semesters worth of pure economics. And it has been actually very successful. About 150 students that have graduated from the program, about a fifth of them work at the IMF. So it's actually made now SAIS the preferred destination for IMF to recruit analysts and researchers. And it's actually opened us to a whole different arena in international affairs, which plays also to the strength of the school, which has always been in international economics. We have a similar 11th-month degree in Bologna on global risk, which is tapping into a market that our faculty and our community had seen as important to Europe. And it was a wonderful effort that actually was a brainchild of professors and alumni who worked together to design the curriculum, to launch it, and actually help with internships and the like to make the program meaningful. And that's now is going to, this year is its second iteration. It's a very young program. And then we also have, many of you are familiar with our MIPP program, which has been one of our most successful programs at SAIS. We now have a executive version of it where working professionals can come to the school every other Friday and Saturday over a 16-month period to get a degree, which is called the Master's in Global Policy. And this is actually its third year that we're matriculating. And it's also a modular program. And although most of the students are local, we've had last year we had a student that came all the way from San Diego every other week to get their master's at SAIS. And now we're looking at new frontiers, for instance, on online education. There are additional programs that we're looking at, and we're trying to reach out beyond the particular cohort group that has been the bulk of the SAIS students. But perhaps the most important transformation at this school have been in its faculty. Some of this was in the coming because many of the faculty that taught you, by now gradually were looking at retiring, and there were others who left the school in a number of years due to attrition and went to other places. But generally, with the help of Johns Hopkins University, the president, the provost, the school made a big investment in faculty development. And you're going to meet some of the new faculty, Professor Soroti, Professor Honig, who all were recruited to the school as part of this effort. And the one change was that we changed the rules of tenuring and recruitment to actually be able to bring young faculty to SAIS. People who could build their careers at SAIS, and they would have a pathway like any other institution to move up and build their careers at SAIS. As a result of this effort, we have expanded the size of, not only sort of replaced faculty that retired or left, but actually expanded the size of our faculty by 45%. That's sort of the permanent faculty. There's a lot more diversity in generation, in gender, in international composition, as well as the even underrepresented minority diversity at SAIS, although we still have ways to go, particularly on that last count. But our faculty is much more diverse. Some of them you might mistake for students when you see them in hallways. And now going forward, it's the mission of the school to sort of rebuild its programs, its curriculum around the faculty that we have. And there are particular areas of strength that exist at SAIS. There are also new areas that we're trying to cultivate. For instance, we now have faculty that focus on cybersecurity and cyber strategy, faculty that focus on global health policy, faculty that focus on global food security and climate change, and areas that are now in demand and are part of what international relations is, and that we are building that capability. Now, it's all of this is happening at an interesting time for international affairs. We did think that the world was changing, both in terms of what the students were looking for, in terms of skills that they needed, where they wanted to go. For instance, compared to when SAIS was established, now perhaps 60% of our American students go to the private sector, 20% to NGOs, which includes the World Bank, and 20% go to public sector. And that was before the 2016 elections. So that sort of puts different set of demands in terms of what they want, not just in the classroom, but from career services, from student services, the importance of internships, for instance, experiential learning. We did see that that there is change afoot, but what we have witnessed since 2016 is an acceleration in all of this. Right. So there are challenges in getting jobs in the public sector. Particularly, the State Department went into a deep freeze in terms of recruiting people. And even now, perhaps people are still a bit skittish in terms of investing in a career in public service. It shall pass, but it clearly was part of the reality. And that we see that young people have different demands in terms of how long they want to be in school, how much flexibility they want in their curriculum. For instance, even a few years ago, it was a big student pressure that got our faculty to accept the fact that you have to allow major and minor in the curriculum. The students were simply upset about having to choose a concentration and not being able to sort of mix and match much more what is the strength of the school. So there's some of these things we are adopting and absorbing. And we're also seeing some broader changes that are happening in the world in terms of many of the issues that we thought were understood, were settled, role of economics and trade in international affairs, a permanently harmonious relationship with China, the idea of North America as a sort of a unit. All of these are up for challenges, and that provides SAIS actually with a very unique opportunity, because in a world in which there are more questions about international affairs than there are answers, there's no better institution and no better place than SAIS to take the lead in this. We're even within Washington, we're better placed than our competition sometimes to be part of this conversation. And a lot of the investment we've made in faculty has actually put us in a very good position to have the intellectual capital to deal with these issues. So our goal essentially is to underscore the strengths of SAIS. I mean, this is a school that I believe has taken the leadership multiple times in defining what is the curriculum for the study of international affairs. If you look back in 1960s, 1980s, many other schools followed changes to the curriculum that was done at SAIS. And I think SAIS has an opportunity again to take the lead in terms of defining what the curriculum is, how do you train the next generation in international affairs. And secondly, that SAIS is well positioned to be engaged and involved in the much broader public conversations around a host of foreign policy issues that are going to shape the future. And not just in Washington, but also internationally. We're very well positioned to have these conversations in Asia, to have these conversations in Europe and elsewhere. We have campuses in Asia and Europe. We have very strong alumni community, and we also have very strong network of partnerships with other institutions and universities around the world to take that leadership position. And so our goal essentially is to work in that direction. The faculty, the administration of the school is pulling in that direction. But also this school ultimately stands on the shoulders of its alumni. And we have a 19,000 strong community in over 70 countries, an extremely stellar community in whatever sort of field of study you look at, from entrepreneurs to diplomats to, even if you looked at the number of ambassadors in Washington currently who are SAIS alumni, or number twos in the embassies who are SAIS alumni, is quite impressive. And so as we sort of embark on this, we really look to alumni engagement and alumni support to do this. And it's not only just because of what's happening in the world, it's also because it's our 75th anniversary. So it's a special year for SAIS. We mark it with a lot of festivities and all sorts of events, and it's going to be a sort of a year-long process through this year, culminating in a marquee sort of celebration in October next year. But I think what better way to celebrate what SAIS has accomplished, to sort of chart the way as to what the next 75 years is going to look like, and to sort of assert the school's leadership in education and thought leadership going forward. I want to, at the end, thank very much the reunion committees for helping us put together this event, for bringing the community together, and also thank all the alumni who are engaging with us this weekend. And I know it's going to be wonderful. And we're going to kick this afternoon off with what would be a typical SAIS activity, which is a very high-powered panel, which will provide you with intellectual nourishment of the kind that I guarantee you're not going to see anywhere else. And you're going to meet some of our new faculty who've joined us only over the past 3-4 years and are in different areas at the school. So without further ado, let me invite Jill to the podium to introduce our next panel. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Nice to see you all today. I'm going to go ahead and jump right in with our question, and then I will bring up our panelists, if that's all right with everyone. And I would also like to say that for today's panel, we'd like to make it very interactive amongst the panelists. So panelists, when you arrive, please feel free to question your colleagues. That's what we at SAIS thrive on, so please feel free to do that. As you can see, today's topic for this panel is the global power structure and America's place in the world today, which brought up quite a few questions. what we're going to talk about is something that Ian Bremmer, the president of the Eurasia Group, brought up at SAIS last month, in which he has previously asserted as, I guess, his group's sort of philosophy at this point. Ian Bremmer asserted that, he argues that the Pax Americana is over, and it is unclear what comes next. Merriam-Webster defines Pax Americana as American peace, used for the period of relative tranquility from circa 1945 to the present day in regions to which U.S. power has extended. The Eurasia Group's Top Risks 2017 report puts risk number 1 as independent America. It asserts that Trump is not promoting isolationism, but rather Trump rejects the comparative weakness of the presidency, and he wants to more directly project American power in service of U.S. national interests. Bremmer and the Eurasia Group say he's a resolute unilateralist. In March of this year, Bremmer was quoted by Business Insider as saying, "It's not just happening in the United States, it's happening across most of the liberal democratic world." And finally, back in June of last year, scholar David Rothkopf wrote a piece for the Washington Post, arguing that Presidents Bush and Obama, as well as Trump, are responsible for ending the Pax Americana. He says that despite their differences in ideology, professional experience, and temperament, all three took steps that alienated American allies, strengthened our enemies, undercut institutions and alliances upon which we have depended for 3/4 of a century, and mismanaged American foreign policy in ways that have left America demonstrably weaker. So that kind of gives you an introduction as to what we'll be talking about today. Nice, easy subject. So right now I would like to turn it over to our panelists. So in your packets you have the full bio, which I was planning on reading, but then I realized that the SAIS the alumni folks have been kind enough to put that in your packets. So that's the longer version. I'm going to give a shorter version. First of all, can I have Professor Dan Honig? Could you come forward? Thank you. Professor Honig, he has recently published a book about the pitfalls in the top-down management of foreign aid. He's also done a lot of work in Liberia, and Somalia, and South Sudan, and myself as a foreign correspondent, I greatly appreciate that, and I look forward to hearing your insights. Next up, if we could have Professor Mary Soroti. Professor Soroti also has a very distinguished background. She is a new professor here at SAIS, professor of the history of international relations. And if I could mention something that was not in my official pamphlet, I found out through coming through her CV that she was admitted to Harvard at age 15. So I just thought I would throw that out there for anyone who might find that interesting. Let's see. Sorry, you shouldn't have sent me your CV.
That's like on page 18.
I found it.
Thank you for letting the rest of us know.
I've been crying myself to sleep.
That's impressive research.
Next, can we have Mr. John McLaughlin? This man needs no introduction. But I will say, for those of you who perhaps have been living under a rock, he was the deputy director and acting director of the CIA. So we're happy to have him here. And finally, Professor Jaime Marquez. Professor Marquez actually worked at the Fed from 1983 to 2013. And since econ was not my strongest subject here at SAIS, I will be letting him lead that discussion without me asking too many in-depth questions. Yeah.
Yes?
Oh,
Sorry about that.
surprise.
Yes, it helped us know who we were, which is good.
Thank you all very much for being here today. I think we'll go ahead and get started. If I could, let me just ask Professor Soroti, if we could start with you, because it was your idea originally to start with this particular question. You work on U.S. foreign policy from the Cold War to the present.
Yes.
And so from your particular area of expertise, is the Pax Americana over?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for all supporting SAIS. I'm as Jill said, I'm new and thrilled to be here, and I am part of the group at the Kissinger Center. Michael Bloomberg, when he was previously considering running for president, decided to start spending time with Henry Kissinger to learn more about foreign policy. And a presidential run did not result, but a beautiful friendship did. And so Michael Bloomberg and Henry Kissinger have become very, very strong friends. And of course, as many of you know, Michael Bloomberg is not only the biggest single donor to Hopkins, he's given Hopkins $1.5 billion, he's actually the biggest single donor to any American institution in the history of the United States of America. So he's the most important donor in the academic world. And he, as I'm sure as many of you know, his giving has been targeted around his interests. So he, of course, funded the Bloomberg School of Public Health as one of his initiatives. He created the Bloomberg Distinguished Professorships as another initiative. Those are professorships where anyone who receives such a professorship has to be appointed both in an arts and sciences department and in a professional school. So your work has to be broad enough that both scholars and practitioners are interested in it. And then, as a result of his interaction with Henry Kissinger, he got a new focus. He and Henry Kissinger started talking about what they thought was missing in the modern academic world. Correct me if I'm getting any of this wrong, by the way. Excellent. And the fine fundraising team was involved in this huge success. And so Henry Kissinger said, you know what is really missing? He said, is good qualitative study of history, politics, and basically international relations. His political science departments have become too quantitative. They're trying to beat the economists at their own game, and they should just be leaving it to the economists. I see some nodding over there. And history departments have gotten too focused on social and cultural history. Now, those are, of course, hugely important topics. The problem is that they've basically eclipsed the study of political history, which has largely disappeared. So while those are fantastic topics in their own right, they're not sufficient. But political history, as a result, has basically started to disappear from American history departments. So Henry Kissinger said to Michael Bloomberg, I think we really need a place where you have good political science work that's qualitative and good historical work on politics that shows the impact of history on current policy. And Michael Bloomberg said, I agree with that. And he called up his best friends, all of whom were billionaires, and they were kind enough to donate a number of endowed chairs, and I'm fortunate enough to hold one of them, the Marie Jose and Henry R. Kravis Distinguished Professorship in Historical Studies. But there's other endowed chairs, there's going to be more professorships coming online, and it's a huge success on the part of fundraising. So hats off to Kim and her fine team. And it also is a fantastic fit for SAIS, because SAIS is exactly the right location for this kind of center. People who do academic work that informs public policy, and people who then can train practitioners such as yourself, so have a direct impact. I'm really finding now here at SAIS, I'm really enjoying teaching graduate students who've already made a commitment to a career in international relations, because it gives my teaching a lot of focus. I know why they're in my classroom. I know that they're interested. I know that they're going to have a career in that field. I know that my teaching is going to have an impact on them, and that's in turn going to have an impact on their work. So SAIS is absolutely the right place for this initiative. Mike Bloomberg has provided the money, and Valley Nasser has been realizing it by hiring one person after another, and so there's going to be a lot of exciting stuff happening. So long-winded way of introduction to say I'm happy to be here. Yes, this question came out of, as Jill said, a very, very well-attended event with Ian Bremmer and Valley Nasser that took place just across the road in the Kenny Herter Auditorium. Ian Bremmer just said, flat out, without any real prefatory remarks, the Pax Americana is over. It's dead. We're in an interregnum. We don't know what comes next, but it's over. And he was so blunt about it. I was really somewhat shocked by that statement, and I started thinking, is that really true? And if so, what are the consequences? And I realized there's no easy way to answer that question. If you look at it from economics, trade, finance, security, the answers might look a little different. Certainly, I know there's been a lot of discussion in the world of economics, and I think we'll be hearing more about that. Have we reached peak trade? Have we reached peak finance? Have we reached peak globalization? Those are all things, those aren't synonyms for the Pax Americana, but they were certainly associated with it, growth in all of those features. And that made me think, have we reached peak alliance? Because my area is actually diplomatic and military history, and I'm currently working on a study of post-Cold War NATO expansion and what it did to U.S.-Russian relations. Spoiler alert, nothing good. And we're currently now witnessing a extraordinary dichotomy of approaches towards NATO. On the one hand, we have a president who has called NATO's core mission into question. All right, the notion that the United States provides unconditional Article 5 guarantees, that the United States will unconditionally consider an attack on any NATO member state as an attack on the United States. President Trump is now talking about a much more transactional arrangement. Well, if you pay enough, maybe. If not, we'll have to see. Seems unfair. The United States shouldering too much of the burden. That kind of language about the alliance coming from a president is unprecedented. It's truly shocking. He left behind only wreckage in his wake at the NATO summit over the summer. And it's just emerged. This is not yet public. So I have this from someone who I'm not allowed to name, but NATO has just decided what it's going to do for its 70th anniversary next year. Can anyone guess? Nothing, because they don't want to give President Trump another stage from which to just swing a wrecking ball through the alliance. And I mean, that is jaw-dropping. So the 70th anniversary of the most successful alliance, military alliance in history, is going to be consciously downplayed. It's going to be held consciously at a very low level, so it's not newsworthy. So journalists like Jill Craig, hopefully,
Who's your source?
hopefully won't show up. And the idea being, that Donald Trump won't show up. And, you know, when you've gotten to that situation, it makes me think, have we really passed peak alliance? Which is truly terrifying for myself as a historian. I was interviewed this summer. Actually, this was through President Ron Daniels' office. There were a very impressive set of New York Times journalists who came to speak to President Daniels and Hopkins faculty, and they asked to speak to faculty in various areas, and they asked to speak to faculty in the area of foreign policy and security. And so my colleague Hal Brands and I spoke to these journalists. And so we sat down with these journalists, and the first question to us was, well, what are historians doing about Donald Trump? Because he's unprecedented. We've never seen anything like him in history. How can historians cope with Donald Trump? And Hal Brands and I, we sort of looked at each other and said, well, actually, that's not the problem. We have actually seen this movie before. We have seen leaders like Donald Trump before who impose tariffs, who say America comes first. We've also seen other leaders who act like this. The problem is that this hasn't happened in America in living memory. So I said, you New York Times journalists, you can't go interview someone who can tell you about this. But we historians remember the 1920s and the 1930s when we saw policies like this, and they were not good decades. So as a matter of fact, our problem as historians is that Donald Trump is precedented, and we know how that story ends. And it ended in a conflagration that marked, as far as I can tell, the nadir of human existence, including the Holocaust. And the erection of the Pax Americana, the act of standing that up, was a conscious response to that. So if we are losing the Pax Americana, I see nothing good on the horizon after this interregnum. So then, this is finally getting back to your question: is it over, the Pax Americana? Look, viewed from my perspective, which is the security perspective, or to be even more specific about it, thinking about NATO, which is what I'm doing all the time anyway, since I'm writing a book on it. I think that we have enough gas in the tank or credit in the account from nearly 70 years of cooperation to make it through 4 years of Trump with our allies. We're asking a lot of them. They're shouldering a lot of insult from us. But I think that we have enough to make it 4 years. I'm not sure we have enough to make it 4 years in a day. And what I mean by that is if President Trump is reelected, given everything we now know, I think then we really will see some major strategic shifts. There's already internally in Germany starting to be, and this I can't believe I'm uttering these words, some long-range planning for dealing with the United States as an adversary. Right now that's very speculative, but the fact that it's happening at all is deeply worrying. And if this country is to re-elect Trump, especially if at the same time in Germany they're going to oust Angela Merkel and have right-wing nationalist leaders over there, which is, given the recent Bavarian election results, a frighteningly real scenario, that would be a true end, I think, to the U.S.-German partnership, which I believe to be the key of the transatlantic relationship, and certainly it will be after Brexit, because Brexit will render Britain so unimportant in the European context as to no longer be a cornerstone of the transatlantic alliance. So I think that we can hold on for now, but a lot depends on elections. So I believe that ultimately the most important factor in determining the future of Pax Americana, and Pax Atlantica actually, will be domestic. The basic rules of politics are number one, get elected, number two, get reelected, and number three, never forget rules 1 and 2. All politics is essentially local at its origins, because you have to have someone elected if you have an elective system, and we still do, as long as we still have elections in 2020. We'll see. I actually was at a conversation recently where someone said, what would happen if the president tried to declare martial law in 2020? And again, I couldn't believe I was actually at this kind of a discussion. It was speculative, but the fact that it was not completely unthinkable was jarring. Anyway, so I think the election results are key. So I think ultimately, if we're going to try to save the Pax Americana, and again, I'm phrasing it in terms of the security relationship, and I'm also phrasing it in terms of something that is positive. I freely admit there are ways to interpret it as negative. But if we're going to try to save the Pax Americana and the Transatlantic Partnership, I believe the most important thing is to register to vote and to vote. And to get people back in office who know to value what we created since 1945 and to repair it while we still can. So thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you. And on this question, I would like to hear everyone's perspective first, and then we can go back and ask tailored questions. So why don't we just go right down the line here? Mr. McLaughlin, your comments?
Yeah, well, first, hello, everyone, and thanks for being here. It's great. I love to go to SICE reunions myself, and perhaps for the reasons that you're here. You meet old friends, it reminds you why you came here. The people you used to go to school with fundamentally haven't changed. They look a little different, but they're the same people. So it's great to see you and to be with you. So Ian Bremmer, end of Pax Americana. I would just say it differently. I would say, quoting the Yale historian Paul Kennedy, that we are stuck in what he called the gap between strategic epochs. We were here, and we're going somewhere else, but we're in this gap. I also remember from my time at the Bologna Center learning about Antonio Gramsci. Antonio Gramsci was the more or less founder of the Italian Communist Party. And in very different circumstances, the Italian communists were philosophers. Someone once asked me, are they independent of Moscow? And I would say, we're talking Gucci communism, for God's sake. So he once said in very different circumstances, around the time of, after World War I, I believe, he said, the old is dead, but the new cannot yet be born. So I think that's kind of where we are in the world. And when I think about this gap, if you will, or Pax Americana, Jill correctly defined Pax Americana as that period from 1945 up until whenever, in which American strength in the world was able to sort things out and prevail. Well, I would break that period down a little bit. I would say, thinking back over my time in foreign affairs, that the period from 1945 until 1991, that's one period. That's the Cold War, which many of you remember vividly. Some of you not, but some of you do. And the Berlin Wall stands outside SICE to remind us of the school's passage through that period and its influence on it. So, Cold War. Cold War ends, and that is then the next, I would say, 17 years, I would call the superpower moment. So I don't know whether that's Pax Americana or not, but the main enemy, as we called the Soviet Union at CIA, is gone. And the United States stands alone in the world as the preeminent power, able to do more or less what we want to do, bringing along whoever we could bring along. We did some noteworthy things and some things that we probably shouldn't have done. But that period of time is unique. 17 years, and I put it from 1991 to 2008, because in 2008 we have the international financial crisis, and it's almost, let my colleague agree or not, almost impossible to overestimate the impact of that, in that it originated largely in financial world in the United States and the United Kingdom, and it really raised in many minds serious questions about the American model for everything. And so we enter a period of time from 2008 till today, and right in the middle of that period, from 1991 to 2008, roughly in the middle, we have 9/11, and we inaugurate a period of 17 years of war that's still going on. So this is a very unusual period, but the main point I want to make is that from 2008 forward, that's when I think the superpower moment begins to unravel. Now, does that mean Pax Americana is gone? Not sure. Here's what I would say, that we have entered a period of time when the United States can no longer do things in the world unchallenged and alone. Not that we ever could, but we had such preeminent power that people would just have to come along with us. I think we've ended that period for now. So the United States cannot do things alone, but you still can't do anything really important in the world without the United States, yet. And that yet is an important one, because I think we're in this gap, and it's sort of ours to define where we go from here. A colleague and I here, Mara Carlin and I, have an article in draft that we will publish sometime in January, in which we started off saying, what would we call this time? We don't have a name for it. You know, we had Civil War, Save the Union. World War I, Save for Democracy. World War II, Defeat the Nazis. Cold War, Contain the Soviets. What do we call this time? We couldn't come up with a name. And our thesis is there are about 5 issues, and I'm going to stop now momentarily because we'll need to move on. There are about 5 issues which, were they to clarify, would help us understand a little better where we are in the world in terms of United States' role and influence. China. I'm just going to give you one sentence on each, and we can come back if you wish, and these will be topics later. China. Is it an adversary, competitor, partner? Maybe all 3. But where will that all settle out? Russia, that's number 2. What do we want really out of our relationship with Russia? What's the end point we envision? Cold War is the wrong metaphor, because in that one, the enemy just disappeared. Russia's not going to disappear. George Kennan, I had a chance to talk to George Kennan in his latter days, and he said that the challenge of my generation was to contain Russia. The challenge of your generation is to figure out how to engage it. Well, we haven't figured that out. Number 3, cyber. I would just say where cyber fits in all of this is up for grabs. We don't have the usual understanding of a conflict domain. What is escalation? What is deterrence? And so forth. That's what, number 3?
3.
3. Number 4, the United States, what Mary talked about. What are we doing now? What is the direction of our policy? Where will we settle out? Will Trump be reelected? It's a matter of great uncertainty in the world, and most international contacts will tell you the first thing they want to talk about is Trump, right? I always just say I'm from Canada. I'm sorry. So if we had clarity on those 4 things, there would start to be some crystallization of where we are in the world. I don't think we'll ever see Pax Americana again as it was in that unique period after World War II, but I don't think we're at the point where the United States is going away or is going to be less than the preeminent single power in the world. One could, it's worth pursuing the point Mary just made about alliances. I think, to me, the alarming thing about the current circumstances is that alliance management may be the single most important thing we should be doing right now.
I agree.
You agree?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. and we're not doing that. So all of those factors are in the mix. I'm not quite with Ian Bremmer, but he may be onto something.
Was alliances your fifth point? Because you had five. Was that the fifth one?
Did I have 5?
Yeah. China, Russia, cyber, U.S. Was there another one?
Oh, technology. But I won't go very far on that, other than to say, Mary raised the question, are we at the limits of globalization? Some people ask, are we at the limits of technology? No, nowhere near the limits. It took 400 years to go from the printing press to the invention of the telegraph, and about 20 years to go from no cell phones to billions of them. So, a simple thing like the miniaturization of circuitry, we're not at the limits of miniaturization yet. So, no, the technology is I think a big question mark in all of this, but that can affect power relationships and everything else. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. Professor Marquez.
Good afternoon, and thank you for coming. I have a slightly different take on this question. So let me apologize in advance. It's going to be a little different. By Pax Americana, the idea itself conveys the notion that there is peace. But since the end of World War II, the United States, and this is just the United States, has been involved in a variety of conflicts. From 1950 to 1953, the Korean War. From 1961 to 73, the Vietnam War. From 1991, the Gulf War. 94, 95, Bosnia. From 2001 to the present, Afghanistan. From 2003 to 2010, Iraq. This is the United States alone. I mean, there may be other countries engaged in other conflicts. And so it's a little jarring, the idea that, oh, this is Pax, and so, but these words in here are kind of a decorative. So that's one. So there's a little, in my mind, tensions. If by this we mean Pax, let's ditch it. Because you can imagine the alternative, right? The other reaction that I have is, this is going to sound a little glib, and I don't mean it that way, but I have 2 daughters, and old, and now they tell me that I cannot tell them what to do. They talk back to me. And I'm sorry to say, I acquiesce. Not that I have the alternative, but when the United States came out of World War II, the United States came out in a unique situation. The major powers in the world were completely devastated to the point that even developing countries were in better shape than they were. And so the idea that we're going to tell them what to do and they're going to say, of course, I mean, it was, and that process took a while for them to realize that that's what they were doing. It doesn't strike me as surprising. And it doesn't strike me as surprising, just like my daughters, that some of these countries say, you don't have to tell me what to do, and I'm not going to do it. And so from that standpoint, the Pax Americana may have been just a moment in our history. And they grew up, they went to college, they're done, bye. And so that should, to me, should have not been a particular surprise, or to tell the truth, a reason to be sorry or angst or anything. The Marshall Plan worked. The Dutch Plan worked. The Bretton Woods Agreement worked. All these plans were aimed at preventing wars among the countries that were in World War II. These plans enabled these countries to grow out of their poverty. And now we are feeling sad for ourselves. It's just a little odd. The last thing that I want to say is, and this is where I come in, or my profession comes in. Most of the discussions that I hear or that I read about whether that we have these pacts or not have the government as a centerpiece. Do we have enough warships? Do we have enough alliances? Are we good diplomats? But the government is always in the middle of it. It's the driving force for it. I think, my perception is that the United States is now, and it has been for a while now, and I'll make references in just a second, in a incredibly strong position to maintain what I would call Pax Americana. But it does not involve the government. It involves the dollar. A while ago, you probably have heard this too, follow the money, and you will find out the truth. My take is this. For us, for me in particular, to figure out whether the United States is in a declining or rising situation, I follow the dollar. The dollar is, without any question, and this has been true for many years, the queen of all currencies. No question. In international trade, in international finance, borrowing, banks. And a moment ago, we talked about the 2008 financial crisis. In the middle of the crisis that was generated in the United States, virtually all the countries moved their funds to the United States. And so you say, why is that? The United States has what I believe to be the best central bank in the world. Now, you may say I'm biased, fine. But you don't have to take my word. No question in my mind that what the central bank in the United States is doing is providing enough credibility to the monetary policies and having this credibility being essentially mirrored in the European Central Bank, in the Bank of England. The idea is to be credible. And this credibility in the United States has been responsible not just for keeping the dollar afloat. No. The dollar's importance in world economic affairs has been rising. And I don't mean by a little bit. What were the main alternatives? Well, when the Japanese in the early 80s, they were the main economy, the Japanese yen is going to overtake the dollar. Nowhere near. When the euro came in 1999, 2000, they're going to overtake the dollar. Nowhere near. The Chinese now say, well, the RMB is going to overtake the dollar. Nowhere near. And I mean, nowhere near. I think that much of this is a move away from focusing on the government as the driving force towards the private sector. I think Apple, I think Facebook, I think Google, I think Microsoft. Is there any country in the world that doesn't use this product? So, I have, as you can tell, a very different take on the existence of, or the relevancy of this notion of Pax Americana. If I take it literally, one, it is not surprising that it is over, to the extent that it is. And if it isn't over, then why do we have these wars? How do we reconcile a notion against the effects of it? And if I were to take one or two sentences out of this from my presentation, I would say, I think the capability of the government in pursuing or establishing this Pax Americana is, to some extent, has diminished. But it diminished, but not gone. And to my sense is that it has been replaced by the U.S. private sector. Follow the dollar. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then, let's see here, Professor Honig, we'd like to hear your perspective on this, and I particularly would like to have you answer this in a slightly different way, given your background in international development. And so I'm just wondering, what are the implications for some countries in the developing world? So if the U.S. is, if we are at the end of the Pax Americana, what does that mean? If we're not, what does that mean? And do countries in Africa care?
Yeah. So thank you. So I guess I'll start, kind of in parallel to where. Oh, and I'm sorry. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Let me not be the only one not to extend my gratefulness at your attendance. So Professor Marquez opened by talking about the sort of the facade of the Pax as seen by looking out from America to America's wars overseas, right? But what if we think about conflict more broadly in the world, right? So, the majority of countries in the world had internal conflict or an internal civil war that killed over 100 people between 1960 and 2010, right? On average, those conflicts lasted more than 10 years, right? In the mid-90s, over a third of the countries in the world had an active civil conflict of some sort, right? And America's role in those conflicts was, of course, complicated, where it played some role. In fact, if it was a pox, as seen from some of these developing countries, it was, I would argue, a smallpox, right? That was visited upon them. And so, as I think about sort of, I'm not the best qualified person on this panel to talk about whether the Pax Americana is over or what it meant if indeed it existed at some time. But I will say that, the transactional arrangement that Professor Sorati pointed to sounds a lot to me like the world that the developing world has long found itself in as it interacts with the great powers of the world. And the idea, as Professor McLaughlin put it, that people used to have to come along, right? That if America wasn't the sole decider, America could sort of, play the melody and have everyone else, sort of lead the dance, right? It strikes me that the biggest way this changes the world is it changes the bargaining position of, as seen from developing country governments, is it changes the bargaining position of developing states, right? And whether you want the leaders of developing countries to have more bargaining power or not depends a lot, I suspect, on which country you have in mind when I say developing countries, right? And what things you think they're bargaining over, right? So we now live in a world where the easiest way to get the American government to commit to resources on your behalf is to have a stalking horse offer from someone else, right, to fund the same sorts of things, right? Developing countries have agency. That agency can be used for good or ill, depending on what they want, how much they represent their citizens, right, or do not, all of which vary across country and within country over time. And I do think that more broadly, this kind of more fragmented bargaining environment, whether we think that's a good thing or a bad thing, seems to me to depend on whether we think the problems we're going to try to solve are fundamentally global public goods, right? Whether they're things that have spillovers between countries. So interstate war, spillovers between countries by definition, right? Climate change, the global climate crisis, the most obvious thing where we could imagine that having a unipolar power, having some set of actors willing to bear outsized costs because they want to maintain the system is particularly useful. Not that it's proven to be that way in the last 15, 20 years in America. But if we think that most of the problems, like the fundamental sort of role of politics, are local, right, then this may well be a good thing, at least on some margins. But I have to say, one of the ways I think it's a bad thing, and I'd love for Professor Marquez to convince me why I'm wrong about this, is that if we've gone from Pax Americana to, I don't know, maybe the Pax of PowerPoint or the Pax of Excel, right? The Pax of sort of corporate tools and finance and private sector actors, right? It strikes me that we are, if we follow the dollar, we will always end up empowering those who have more of them, right? And that's just not just between countries, it's also within them. And so I think one of the things we do have to worry about is that this shift in global order has follow-on benefits or costs in the developing world for the distribution of power within each country's order. And to the extent that, and in some ways it enhances elites, and in some ways it undermines them. But the private sector side of it, and the increasing focus on those dollars, in my view, has a kind of net enhancement role. And so more opportunities for developing countries in some ways, right? Whether that's pro-welfare or anti-welfare, depends on whose welfare you're talking about and who's the decider. And a realigned world order with realigned winners and losers, both domestically and sort of cross-nationally. Yeah, it's, to me, the question isn't, is, as you framed it, not was there a Pax Americana, but given that the world has changed, right? Given that the distribution of power has changed, what does that mean for developing countries, and what does that mean for what we can expect to see spill over onto our borders and come into our television sets and into our lives in the 20, 30 years to come? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Marquez, do you have a response to his last statement? I'd like to get some debate going here.
I'd like to respond to that.
Okay, sure.
Well, no, go ahead first, Professor Marquez.
I think there are a couple of items that I wanted to bring out. Number one, what's the alternative? International trade and international finance is going to take place in a currency. The use of a currency is a social convention. They use dollars because their friends use dollars, and their friends use dollars because their cousins use dollars, and all of them are using dollars because all of them use dollars. The key here is not whether there is dollar or something else. The key is that they are doing so willingly. We're not imposing on them the choice of a currency for holding their savings or carrying out international transactions. We don't tell them, use dollars. They're doing it on their own. Secondly, I'm sure you're familiar with this, you pick a dollar bill and one of the sides says, "In God we trust." And so the use of the dollar resides on trust. Trust in what? Trust in a system that defends the law. Trust in a system that it is credible. That's why I think they use the dollar. It's not because we told them to have it, that they have to use it. We don't force that on anybody. The same way that we don't force anybody using Google or using Apple or using Microsoft. They choose it, and they choose that. Think about the alternative. China is trying to instill their currency as a competitor to the US dollar. And they're having their government aim at this. They go into some African countries, they invest in these countries, but a side effect of this investment is that some of the transactions have to be carried out in RMB. You say, well, what's the big deal about that? I don't have a problem with that. The glitch is that, do you trust the RMB? Well, the answer to that question is, do you trust the government of China? And then you say, do I have any reason not to trust the government of China? And the answer to me is, well, are they capricious when they set a particular policy that they're going to censor, restrict access to the internet? The answer is yes. Do they have particular policies that I personally don't like? The answer is yes. Then, to me, that's another way of saying, I don't trust them, therefore, I don't use their currency. So to me, it's two things. They're using their currency, our currency, willingly. We don't force that on anybody. And the second one is that they trust it. They trust the Central Bank of the United States. They trust, notwithstanding all the recent development, they trust a legal system in the United States that, for better or for worse, is, better or for worse, most of the time, impartial. Protect property rights.
Mr. McLaughlin, we'll get to you next, but Professor Honig, do you have any response or rebuttal to that?
Yeah, I mean, just to say that, my concern is not with the use of the dollar as a medium of exchange. It's with the idea that in a world where governments and alliances matter less, the private sector has relatively more influence. So I didn't mean to suggest that nor do I think there's any way or any alternative to the use of the dollar. In fact, when I've worked for central banks in developing countries, I have been part of recommending that countries dollarize from time to time, right? You lose monetary policy tools, but you gain stability, right? So my truck is not with the dollar per se. It's with the idea that in a world where we ask governments to step back and where sometimes the rhetoric around that is that that's actually a good thing, I'm not sure I agree. And I think that's true here in the U.S. too. I hear, Barack Obama, a president who I voted for, who I had a lot of respect for, said multiple times, government is not going to be the source of solutions to large problems, right? That solutions were going to come from the outside, and government should adopt what the private sector has innovated. I think in some domains that makes a lot of sense, but my view is that in a lot of others, that's a disturbing trend in thought. And why do I think it matters? What do I think the alternative is? Well, it seems to me that the rhetoric around these questions and the rhetoric that happens the way the conversation is structured in rooms like this one, and in the rooms all of you sit in your professional lives, has something to do with what happens in the world. And so I do think discourse and frames matter in this case. But just to say, it's not the medium of exchange point I meant to bring up, but rather the private sector influence one.
Okay, thank you. Mr. McLaughlin, your comment, and then we'll go to audience questions. So those of you in the audience, Professor, did you have something else you wanted to say? And so after that, then you in the audience think of some questions, and we'll open it up. So please, go ahead.
Well, Professor Marquez is the first economist I've heard who makes me feel good.
That's why they invited me.
And he's not one of those two-handed economists. You know the Harry Truman remark, right? So, give me a one-armed economist. No on the one hand, on the other hand. So I don't disagree with anything Professor Marquez said, but I think we're talking different levels of analysis. And I don't want to speak for Professor Surratt, but I think she and I are talking a different kind of analysis than Professor Marquez. I think what he's laid out is foundational. It's foundational. It is the solid foundation that exists for the United States, the trust in the dollar. Very important point he just made about the fact that this trust and the use of the dollar is voluntary. Don't disagree with that. And so the question about whether, let's not call it Pax anymore, let's just call it the American moment or whatever we want to call it. The question of whether that's over or not then becomes, I think, a question of what do we do with that foundation? What do we do with it? How do we lever it in the world? How do we project it? If you look at this, to add to what Professor Marquez said, purely in terms of power evaluation, you all went to SAIS, so we could walk through the elements, the typical elements of power in the, first course you take here, I guess. Natural resources. Well, the United States is really well endowed compared. Let's compare the United States and our only peer competitor at this point, rising, China. India, perhaps, but I can't go there. I don't know enough. But China is the one that seems to be not just rising, but challenging us. Well, natural resources. Well, I think we're way ahead. I mean, within a decade, energy people tell me, on the North American continent, we probably will be self-sufficient in energy. Agriculture. We could feed the world. Protected by two oceans. So on all of the old IR elements of power, innovation. China is mostly, I want to make an exception to this, but mostly an integrator of technology, not a creator of it, but they're brilliant at integrating it. Although people who study China more than I do tell me, be careful because they are probably moving ahead of us in artificial intelligence and biology. That's all I can say about it. I don't know more. I'm quoting what China experts have told me, Mike Lampton, people like that. Nonetheless, when it comes to innovation, who's better than the United States? Maybe someone out there in some area, but across the board, our universities, our research, the freedom to challenge things and to debate so far in the United States, that's another point. Demographics. Okay, we have this big immigration fight going on now. It's kind of stupid, I think. We are really, our politicians are emphasizing the downside of immigration. We're actually refreshed by immigration, I think. And our population is growing here at a reasonable rate. The last figures I saw were like 1.7, something like that, whereas populations in our competitors are aging. The most interesting statistic I heard about Japan is that the sale of adult diapers now outpaces the sale of baby diapers in an aging population. China, I don't have the data, but China has an aging population as well, which they're trying to fix. So demographics. Culture. Something like 70% of the receipts for Hollywood movies are in places like the box office in places like China and Russia. Our culture is still preeminent in the world. A friend of mine who goes to Iran all the time says, this is Robin Wright, the journalist you may know, says people don't realize that on the street there's no country in the region where the United States is more popular than in Iran. Not with the regime. And we may have just insulted them on a number of levels, but so that may be changing. But so my point is, add that to the dollar, we have a strong foundation, and then you go to what Professor Surratt was saying. What are we going to do with it? That trust. You mentioned, Professor Marquez, that so much of it is based on trust in our legal system. Well, our legal system is currently being attacked by the president. At least that's how I hear him. That's got to puzzle the world. So we're not, I don't think we're at the point of being in danger, but forces are nibbling at the edges of the kinds of things that create the trust that buoys the dollar, I think. And that's what we have to worry about. And then what we do with all of this power and influence we have is up to us. And I'm going to stop there.
Okay, well, thank you all very, very much. And with that, I'd like to open it up to audience questions. The first one back here. I guess we'll just, what's easier? What do you prefer, one at a time or a few at one time?
Yeah, one,
A few?
whatever.
One, a few?
But let's use your time. In other words, if each of us answers every question, you won't get many questions. So why don't one of us just take it on, or you direct it to one of us, what I would suggest.
Okay, so we'll just do one question.
Or
What'd you say? Okay, so let's do 3 questions, and then we'll sort of try to find some themes.
I'm going to phrase it as a challenge. I spent enough years in front of a microphone.
Okay.
So I'm going to phrase it as a challenge. My challenge is, I believe Pan American's rise or demise was accelerated with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the hubris of not immediately realizing that the chaos that would ensue with a realigned world order where state systems of power began to wane. At the same time, John, we're taking cyber and technology separate. I would put them together, and I would say at the same time, in the words of Alvin Toffler, there was a wave of disruptive technology powered by the internet. Cyber falls under that. At the same time, talk about non-state actors. I'm going to use the word trans-state actor. So you have a rise of trans-state actors and multinational corporations that are the best positioned to take advantage of that. And I agree with you, Professor. Your insight about the dollar is absolutely brilliant. We still use the 3-legged stool of diplomacy, defense, and development, but we don't include dollar in that. So that's my question. That's my challenge to all of you.
Okay, and since that one involved a few different themes, let's just answer that now. Professor Soroti, could you go ahead and start with the Berlin Wall
Actually, I
question?
think that the question was more directed.
Was that one for, okay, go ahead, go ahead.
Me?
Yeah.
Let's just start, I believe the first was about Pan America's
Pax
rise.
America. Pax America.
Oh, sorry, yeah, okay, I was trying to figure out the Pan America. I'm missing something. Okay, Pax America's rise after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And then cyber,
So the rise at the same time, we had the Berlin Wall. We did not fully, in the words of Francis Fukuyama, history has ended. We did not really realize what the wave of chaos.
Yeah, okay, I got it. I see what you mean.
Technology rises, empowered by the internet.
Yeah, no,
You have multinational corporations,
yep,
brands,
yep, yep. I may sound a little defensive on this because, not, because I was in a profession where I don't think we missed that. In fact, what happened when the Berlin Wall fell was this town was taken over with two words, peace dividend. And in my old profession and in the military, there were huge budget cuts. We took like a 23% budget cut after the Soviet Union fell because everyone said, well, those guys you were working on, they're gone. And I happened to, at that time, be working on Russia. I was directing our Russian effort, and I had to reduce that by 42% because the primary reductions were taken on the country that had just gone away. Those of us involved in trying to see where things were going, this is why I will sound defensive, kept trying to tell people, no, it's not over. We were grappling with a whole series of things at the most practical, narrow, granular level. Well, what about the nuclear weapons the Soviet Union had? They're scattered over 4 countries. Where are they? We knew, but how do we get them, how do we secure those? Figured it out. What about the Balkans? Right, a couple of years after the Berlin Wall comes down, trouble starts in the Balkans. By 1995, 96, President Clinton finally has moved to send American forces in there, and you have the whole Balkan War period up to 2000. And the developing world, I'm sure, in this period of time, is also rather tumultuous. So I think those of us who had our noses pressed right up against the foreign policy and international security world were aware that the troubles weren't over. To your other point, I don't know that any of us saw the onrush of technology to the extent that it has been consequential, or everyone talked about the role of multinational corporations and actors and non-state actors and so forth, but I don't think that was forcefully borne in upon us until later, frankly. And, but I'd just stop there and say that at least in the professional national security world, there was no illusion that we were heading into a period of snakes and dragons after dealing with a monolith for all those years. Yeah.
Okay, next question, I think right over here, yes.
I have 3.
Oh, actually, there was a gentleman, ma'am, could I just have the gentleman behind you first and then you?
I remember a definition during the Cold War of NATO as the entity which would keep the Soviets out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. Revised that slightly when the Cold War was officially over, to keep Russia out. How's NATO doing on all 3 of those?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's an interesting question. I had thought of applying that. So the comment to which, I'm sorry, I didn't get your name. Mort. To which Mort is referring is a famous comment attributed to Lord Ismay, the first Secretary General of NATO, that the real purpose of NATO was to keep the Soviets out, keep the Germans down, and keep the Americans in. And that, of course, among historians has occasioned all kinds of debate about the extent to which The Soviets wanted in, the Germans wanted up, and the Americans wanted out. There's actually a huge debate. You would think we would know this by now, but there's actually a huge debate over the extent to which the Soviets wanted in to Western Europe. There are some war plans that exist for Soviet invasions of Western Europe, and certainly Polish statesmen, Polish leaders say, oh, these were serious, these real plans for attack. But there's it's a point on which reasonable people can differ, because what the Soviet Union really did was stand pat, right? It got its buffer zone and it stood pat. And then there's a question of how much the Germans really wanted to dominate Europe in their divided state, still recovering from the horrors of Nazism and what that did to their society. And then there's also a question of the extent to which we wanted out. The United States had decided in 1945 that whatever it did in 1918 was clearly wrong because it had led to World War II. So isolationism was clearly a disaster. So we were, in fact, very committed. So that's a very interesting comment. And actually, one of the books that I have written on it, and Jill's right to mention, I write primarily about the end of the Cold War. I was actually unreasonably pleased to see my book cover back there, actually. That's new. I haven't actually seen that. So the collapse. So I'm feeling very pleased about that. And when I studied, I've written a book about the fall of the Berlin Wall, which is that book, and then another book about the U.S. foreign policy that followed that event. And when I wrote the second book, the one about U.S. foreign policy after the fall of the wall, I just assumed that at some point I would find the master file in the White House or NSC or State Department where they had the big debate about the U.S. role in Europe and whether we should stay or withdraw, whether it was time to really cash in on the peace dividend in a big way. Because NATO's main mission, its actual mission, was to defend Western Europe from the Soviet Union. So you could arguably have said, check, mission accomplished, time to go home. And so I thought I would see some consideration of that, and I didn't. I'm still looking for it, a decade later. The assumption was NATO worked, don't fix it. We just won the Cold War with the institutions that we have. Why on earth should we change them or get rid of them? So we're going to stay in. So what's interesting now about the Trump era in a horrifying way is this discussion is finally happening. We finally have a president saying, what's in NATO for us? Should we still be in there? Can we pull out? So the discussion I thought I would see at the end of the Cold War is actually happening now. So it's interesting what you're suggesting to pull the question forward. How are we doing at keeping the Germans down, Russia out, and the U.S. in? Well, U.S. in is starting to look questionable all of a sudden. U.S. wasn't going to pull out in the Cold War, and as I found out, it wasn't going to pull out in the early post-Cold War. But now all of a sudden we are having that discussion, so that is truly new. Russia clearly does want in, at least in cyber terms. It hacked Brexit. It hacked the elections. It just basically made sure that Macedonia didn't become North Macedonia, because that would have enabled it to go into NATO, because it would have removed an obstacle to its NATO membership. So Russia now clearly does want in. And now it is really a question if the Germans want to be kept down or not. For the first time ever, there's a discussion of a German nuclear capability. So it's interesting because that quotation, that's a very insightful question, that quotation was very famous, but not actually applicable to the time period in which it was said. Since, to repeat, it was about keeping the Soviets out, but it doesn't seem they wanted to come in, keeping the Germans down, but they didn't want to come up, and keeping the U.S. in, but we didn't want to pull out. Now, all of a sudden, that's all reversed. So suddenly that question is valid. So thank you for raising that point.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
I'm wondering, Mary, when we were in the period of expanding NATO, was there?
I like how you phrase that in the past tense. That's interesting.
Yeah.
There's people in NATO who would object to you saying it that way, but that's interesting.
Well, I remember it happened in the Clinton administration, but, and I watched the debate unfold up to a point, but never clear to me whether there was serious thought given to
Russia
actually
going in.
inviting the Russians
Yeah.
in, or whether the Russians actually wanted to be invited in and how they would have responded. What do you think?
All right, so this is a dangerous question because I am currently writing a book about this. So I can talk about this till everyone in the room loses the will to live.
Or 4:55 when we have to be out.
Or 4:55 p.m., whichever comes first. Mass extinction or 4:55 p.m., whichever comes first. So, I'm trying to. So, all right. So the very short answer is there's kind of a trajectory. So I recently had a real breakthrough declassification, which is very exciting. After 3 years of effort, got all Clinton-Yeltsin conversations declassified. Whether they're in person or on the phone. If you are interested, I just did a posting of some of the most interesting documents with the National Security Archive, where I edited, roughly the 24 most interesting documents together with an archivist and provided captions, and I have work under peer review now on this area. And it's been a little surreal to read these documents because when you read the ones from 1993, which is 25 years ago, the spirit of optimism and hope about what's going to happen in the U.S.-Russian partnership is palpable. The idea that, you know, we finally put the thermonuclear standoff behind us, we have both superpowers on board, the sky's the limit. And, you know, you have these discussions about of denuclearization, de-targeting. You have top Soviet and Russian at this point, and U.S. military leaders, people who spent their lives planning to destroy each other, shaking hands and going down missile silos in Ukraine to basically remove weapons. Bill Perry, the Secretary of Defense, personally goes over and presses the button that denuclearizes, that destroys missiles in Ukraine. I mean, unthinkably good stuff was happening.
Well, a director of Central Intelligence visits Moscow.
A director of Central Intelligence. I mean, the list goes on and on and on and on. So in answer to your question, in these early days, yeah, there's discussion of Russia coming on board. There's even, this I just, like my jaw hit the table. Boris Yeltsin, the president of Russia at the time, says, you know, but we're going to have to think about this Russian membership in NATO because it'll make China very worried. Yeltsin says this. But the idea is he's already thinking, you know, strategically about this. But fairly quickly, it becomes apparent that NATO expansion is about Poland, not about Russia. And it also becomes apparent that a very aggressive form of NATO expansion is going to take place with full Article 5 guarantees right away instead of a phased process with associate memberships and so forth. And that really gets Yeltsin's back up. And by late 94, there's already starting to be very, very serious tension about NATO expansion. And that sort of moment, that those lights that had winked on of possibilities, including Russia and NATO, that winks out pretty quickly.
You will want this book. I want this book now.
I've only written like 1.5 chapters, so don't hold your breath, but I'm working on it.
Well, thank you very much. And then we'll go, ma'am, you in the red. Although, can I negotiate with you and make it 2 questions since we've only got a few minutes?
Combine 2 questions into one.
Great, perfect.
I have a comment. I can't resist making. And this is for John. John, I think it was you who laid out 5 big issues that you're concerned about.
Yeah, and I left out one, actually, I just remembered. But terrorism, whether it's
Well,
here,
that is exactly where I was
whether
going.
it's gone or what.
Yeah, I heard nothing from any of you, to the best of my recollection, my memory's gone, you know, but I heard nothing about terrorism, I heard nothing about the Middle East. And I'm not conflating those two by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm a little surprised to have heard nothing about either issue. And then to Professor Caroti, I was very much I was in the Clinton administration. I was very much involved in Gore Turner-Murden.
Oh, yeah, okay,
And to your point,
Yep.
we in the U.S. government were filled with hope.
Yep.
The Russians were asking us for help.
Yep.
With reforming their economy, reforming their healthcare system, their agriculture sector, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How did this happen? And one other real quick comment. John, I believe it was you also talked about China and technology. I'm certainly not a China expert either, but the more I read about China, the more I am becoming convinced, and again, I'm not an expert, that the Chinese have moved beyond simply adapting, and they're developing their own technologies.
They're getting there.
Especially in AI, robotics, and a couple of other areas. And again, everything I read convinces me that China has basically caught up with us. A2AD especially, or they almost caught up with us. So I don't know if anybody has any comments.
Well, I'm going to stick with the first question. You said question, so the statement can be answered afterward if you don't mind. But the question is, no one has brought up terrorism. Does anyone have a response on that?
I was going to raise terrorism, and had I done it, I would have said the following, which is, it's also another clarifying item for us, because the question is, has terrorism, which was the abiding concern of the United States for 10 years, really, has it reached the point of serious threat, but more at the nuisance level? In other words, it's just not going to go away, but we won't stamp it out, but it's always been there anyway. Or do we have the potential for a comeback of terrorism? I think it's too soon to tell. It would be wrong to drop our guard, because when you look at ISIS in particular, it's very different from Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda never owned territory of any consequence. It rented territory of sorts from Afghanistan, but ISIS, I think, got a little drunk on owning that caliphate they had, which was sizable. They also have a global structure. They are present in significant ways in 8 or 9 countries around the world, some in Africa, at least one in Asia. And they still have great skill online, and they still have a lot of money. So all of those things tells me that they're going to continue to be a problem. We just don't know at what level yet. And people like Bruce Hoffman at Georgetown, whose judgment is usually pretty good on this sort of thing, says that in the margins of this, Al-Qaeda is rebuilding. I have always thought that the new leader of Al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, doesn't get enough credit because he's not charismatic. What credit? Who wants to give him credit? But the point is, he's an engineer, physician, and he's smart, and he's got street creds in the terrorist world because he spent a lot of time getting beat up in an Egyptian prison. So I think it's too soon to know, basically. And we can't drop our guard on it yet.
And I just wanted to, just briefly, yeah, that's terrific. You were involved with the Gore Chernomyrdin Commission. Apparently, they had numbers like, Roman numerals like Super Bowls, number 1, number 2, number 3 of the meetings. And yeah, everything I said applies to those. I've seen some of the documentation as well, more from President Clinton than from Vice President Gore. But yeah, exactly, the spirit of optimism in the documents is palpable. And of course, it's been interesting to read these documents and to be reminded of the fact that Gore was going to be the next president of the United States. Right? So he was taken very, very seriously in a way that vice presidents aren't always taken seriously. And he was in on high-level meetings. He was in on decision-making. He was fully dialed in, read in, everything. And so it was an interesting experience to be reminded, yes, this person was the next president of the United States, and everyone was taking what he was doing very seriously.
But that's an interesting question you raised about how did we move from that period, because I experienced it even in the intelligence world where we didn't have kumbaya with the KGB, but we could talk to them soberly and seriously, and we tried to get cooperation going, and it worked up to a point. How do we get from that to this? I think that's a book yet to be written. And Professor Marquez, we're just giving
As a
her
matter of
homework
fact.
here. But Professor Marquez may have something to say about this because my non-economist view is that we pushed them to privatize too quickly and too sloppily, and so much of the country's wealth was grabbed by what we now call the oligarchs. Because why? Because they were the former communists who knew where everything was and had all the contacts and so forth and so on. And it's important to remember that when Yeltsin left in 1999, his last speech to the populace was to apologize for the mess he was leaving. So at that point, Russia was a mess, but there was that period there where the media was almost, I think, completely free. It was an exciting time in Russia, and there was cause for optimism. Is that how you would see it?
Yeah, I mean, there is a tendency to believe that what works in one country works in every other country, or a tendency to believe that the invisible hand doesn't need a passport. Right? The invisible hand is this thing that we have, like when in trouble, call the invisible hand. I think that what you're alluding, first, I agree with it, is that there is in the case of Russia, my sense is that there was and in China, a mismatch between the speed at which one sector of the country moves compared to others. So if you have, for example, the privatization of key industries in Russia, but you keep the old system, the old legal system intact,
Yeah.
that creates opportunities that are not exactly, that are beneficial to some people and not others. And my sense is that some of that may be going on in China, that you unleash the forces of the invisible hand and it will go and do the job. But to the extent that we want a system where some forces are kept in check by the application of the law, and we don't update the law, we don't protect property, private property, then to that extent, it creates the type of misalignments that you're noting.
That's a real insight.
I would also like to point out that Professor Marquez has won the SAIS Excellence in Teaching Award 4 times since 1996, including this year. So I think that's an interesting fact.
But can I tell a joke following that?
Sure.
Okay, because this illustrates a point he was making. I once had to brief President Reagan after he had left office. He's out of office. He was going to Poland and to Germany. And I was told, I'd never briefed him, they said, have some jokes ready. He likes a joke and he'll tell you one back. And I have to say, he was, I don't know what your image of him is, but he was alert, smart, asked good questions, right on. I mean, it was terrific. But he said, Poland, what's going on there? And I told him the following joke, which will mean nothing to most people. I tell this to students and they stare at me blankly. But the joke was like this: how many poles does it take to screw in a light bulb? You know this joke? None. It's all done by market forces. But that was the feeling at the time about, the invisible hand all over Eastern Europe.
Thank you. We'd also like a magic trick, in case you were wondering. Mr. McLaughlin is a very talented self-made magician. Since we only have about 8 more minutes, first of all, I'd like to target one professor. Does anyone have a question for Professor Honig? Because I feel like he's gotten off pretty easy this time.
It's okay, feel free.
You have a
Feel free
question.
to let me off.
A
Yeah.
question for you and an observation that comes off of what John Lafacum said. I was in Beijing helping run a conference over Labor Day weekend, and Beijing was filled with African leaders being wined and dined by the Chinese government. And I saw that as a symbol of them solving their resource problem by basically taking over Africa, at the same time that our president was saying the things he said about Africa. Yeah. How is that working for the Africans?
Yeah, so I agree with everything in that sentence except the phrase taking over. So that is to say,
I saw you bring.
yeah, exactly. So the same way people adopt the dollar voluntarily, right? They sign resource agreements with the Chinese government voluntarily. It's no less voluntary than if you signed it with Exxon, in my view, right? So those are voluntary actions. But I think the broad thrust, I'm 100% on board on. And in fact, more African heads of states showed up to this conference in Beijing than showed up to the UN General Assembly, right?
And
so-
so the rest of us out of central Beijing so that they would not be bothered by traffic.
Yeah, and I think there are lots of reasons to prefer China if you're an African state. Look, I mean, Africa's a big place, lots of different countries. This is a generalization. All those caveats aside, the fact is, if something's going wrong with the Chinese firm that's helping you build the road, right? You can go to the Chinese government and they can influence their agent, right? Their related company, their parastatal, right? If the same thing happens in America, and you go to the American Economic Counselor, they will say to you, I'm sorry, this is a private sector firm. There's nothing I can do. Try to take them to court, try to sue them in the US, maybe I'll try to be of some help, right? So I think that, look, if what you're looking for is what in development is often called capacity building, actual skills transfer, that's not offered in great regard, in great amounts, right? But if you want that stadium or that dam or that road built on time, as promised, where all of the uncertainty and the unexpected things get owned by the international side, right? Rather than become reasons for non-completion, you could do much worse than looking at Chinese assistance.
Okay, thank you. And I've got time for one more question. I think actually
and bargain.
you,
And
actually,
bargain.
sorry, and everyone, I apologize. Time is, my Ugandan colleague always says time is not on our side, and that's very true. So I've been given 5 more minutes, so we'll do one question, and then panelists, will you be at the happy hour?
Where is it?
I knew it. I believe it's at the NITSE building in the courtyard, correct? So if panelists, if you could come, I'm sure we have a lot more questions for you that could be better discussed over a cold one.
They're paying, right?
What'd you say?
They paying?
They have to answer that
It's the
one.
economist.
With US currency, the dollar. So, sir, you're last, and then we'll wrap things up.
Thank you. My question has both an economic and national security component, and it's about the rise of cryptocurrencies. And I want maybe Professor Marquez and Professor McLaughlin to talk about both the economic and national security implications of what's happening.
I don't think I'm going to be of great help in there. And so from here on out, it's just barking. Maybe a little better, but not much. The idea of cryptocurrency, the original idea, is to remove the government as the intermediary between your purchase and my receipt. By and large, all these transactions, when you pay something, you will go, say, to your credit card, then from your credit card goes to the bank, then from the bank goes to the Federal Reserve, and then it goes back to the seller. Some people don't like that. They may have their reasons, and that's fine with me. What cryptocurrency is doing is enabling you to transact directly with me by you providing to me information about your capacity to pay. Currently, when the merchant sells you something, he or she is acting on the faith of their credit card, and the credit card company is acting on the faith of the central bank. And so there's a chain of trust, let me call it in that way, that guarantees your peace of mind when you put the credit card and you get the stuff. Some people don't like that. And so what they're looking for is to speed up the type of transactions. In international finance, or in finance in general, you carry out a transaction, and that transaction gets posted the following day. They don't want that. They want it posted now. And the cryptocurrency is, don't view it so much as numbers versus a piece of paper. View it as the other side of the transaction, knowing everything that there is to know about your capacity to carry out that transaction, and vice versa. And so the element, what's being done is removing the element of trust by an element of verification. The verification is carried out at once. That's the driving force. That has some central banks concerned. Part of it is that you are now shifting your trust from the wisdom of the central bank to the wisdom of an entrepreneur that it is maintaining this blockchain. Okay? And so if that person goes out of business, you're done. And so it's where do you place the trust? Do you place the trust with a private supplier of money, or do you place the trust with a central bank? Central banks want to get involved in, central banks want to get it both ways. One, the ability to maintain trust in the currency, and at the same time, they want to speed up the transaction. So some central banks are trying to inject themselves into this.
Last comment?
I don't have a lot to say about that. When I heard the definition for the first time of cryptocurrency, as Professor Marquez just went through, I thought that was PayPal. I mean, you know,
It is.
It's sort of.
It's a variant of it.
It's a sort of a variant of PayPal, but it also strikes me as something that won't last for the very reasons that Professor Marquez laid out at the beginning about the trust that's placed in a transaction because of the foundational role of legal systems and such, and credit. I don't personally do business in China, but I understand that's one of the problems there is how do you know you're going to get paid if you've bought something on credit? Companies have said that to me. So I see the cryptocurrency thing as being a kind of could be wrong on this, but maybe a fad that's useful right now in organized crime and in the terrorism world. It may be replacing the role of the hawala in the terrorism world, which is, you know, the ancient system of moving money without any records. But I don't see it lasting. I see it probably being superseded by some smarter idea. But so it may be one of these transitional things between traditional money movement and something yet to be imagined. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you all very, very much for this. I appreciate it. We've had an outstanding panel that's made me feel very guilty about all the time I've wasted watching Netflix over the years when you've been doing more constructive things with your time. So anyway, thank you all very much, and I will excuse you now off the stage.
Oh, by the way, I don't have that statistic. I was trying to write them down. Where did you get the statistics about conflict? That was useful.
We get off. We have to go.
Oh, okay. Okay, but don't leave yet. Don't leave yet, sorry. I'm just allowing them to leave the stage so we can start our next presentation.
Civil War, 2004.
Miguel
see.
and Blackman. Okay.
B-L-A-T-T, and it's
Oh,
2004.
Blackman. Okay, 2004. Okay,
I'll just go ahead and get
Okay.
started. Let's
Yeah.
just start.
Yeah.
So right now, I would like to introduce Kim Morton, who is the Associate Dean for Development and Alumni Relations. She will be presenting the 50th anniversary medallions for Johns Hopkins University. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Jill, and thank you for a fantastic panel. It gives us a glimpse of what it's like to be a SAIS student today, especially on a Friday afternoon. I appreciate all of your engagement and your thoughtfulness. I want to welcome you to our 10th, 25th, and 50th reunion classes. As Vali said, this is only our third year hosting a reunion here in Washington. I know the Bolognese have been having fantastic reunions in Bologna's for years, and we want to make that welcome back here in Washington as well. So thank you for taking part in this. You graduated, class of 1968, 50 years ago. This is my favorite part of reunion, being able to celebrate what you have done over the last 50 years. You graduated in a year that remains arguably the most historic year in American history. Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy were both assassinated that year. With the Apollo 8 mission, for the first time in history, humans orbited the moon. North Korea captured a US ship, and Olympic athletes raised fists in Black leadership salutes. So much has changed, but so much remains the same. So today we celebrate your 50th anniversary and your globally significant contributions to the world. And I want to celebrate the remarkable group that's gathered here and your extraordinary experiences. You've come from as far away as New Zealand to some of you as nearby as 24th Street. Among you are published authors, ambassadors, military leaders, professors, investment bankers, and 4 PhDs in this room alone, just in this little group. So it's my immense pleasure to present to you, each with a medallion on behalf of the Johns Hopkins University Alumni Association. We honor your achievements. We thank you for bringing to life the values that our school upholds and that our students aspire to. So as I read your name, please come forward to be recognized. Sierra Janik, a current SAIS student, is going to be presenting a medallion to you. So our first alumni, David Baker. Bruce Benton. Lewis Cohen. Morton Dworkin. A little time to get. Pam Flaherty and Peter Flaherty. Peggy Jones. Joseph McBride. Robert Mertz. Harry Qualman. Larry Schmidt. Sally Shelton Colby. Michael Van Duzen. Shelton Williams. And on behalf of Ed Wilson, we've got Bonnie Wilson. And Catherine Young, who has come the furthest to celebrate. So, on behalf of the entire SAIS community, I want to express my sincerest thanks for remaining a part of the SAIS family. Let's have a final round of applause for our class of '68.